let's talk about sexual reproduction. We'll write it in our science notebooks. So follow along with me and I'll tell you what's right. Yeah, it's your boy Nickel, and let's get started. Put your title up on your science notebook. Sexual reproduction. All right, let's talk about what this is. Well, with sexual reproduction, we end up with genetically diverse offspring, which means that the babies all have a little bit different genetics. They're similar but different. So we have genetically diverse offspring, which are created from the fertilization of an egg cell by a sperm cell. And remember, egg and sperm are those gamete cells. The sperm has half the DNA, the sperm has half the DNA, and the egg has half the DNA, and half plus half equals a whole. So you can make a whole organism if you have each of those two cells. So the egg and sperm, also known as the gametes. Didn't want to give it away so quick there, but gametes, these are actually, egg and sperm are the only haploid cells in our bodies. We have a lot of cells in our bodies, but the only ones that are haploid are the ones are eggs and sperm. And so in the male body, biological male body, the only haploid cells are sperm. And in the biological female body, the only haploid cells are those egg cells. And remember, haploid means they only contain half of our DNA. So when the father contributes the sperm, half of the father's DNA is in the sperm. Half of the mother's DNA is in the egg. And a half plus a half makes a whole organism, a whole offspring, a baby. Okay, so a new word here is meiosis. Now, meiosis is a cell division process, and it's a process of creating those haploid gametes, the sperm and egg, from our quote-unquote normal diploid cells. So that's like all the other cells in our body. So for example, in the biological male body, the testes are what have those diploid cells that get turned into the haploid cells. Remember, diploid cells are our cells with 100% of our DNA. So we need 100% of our DNA for our cells to know what their job is. And so almost all of our cells are diploid cells. They have all the DNA so they know what their job is. But the job of a sperm is to only have half the DNA so it can combine with an egg. So in order to get the half, we need to take half of our DNA from that pool of our whole DNA. And in order to separate our whole DNA in half, so we make sure we get exactly half of our DNA, so we have 50%, we have to go through this, or our cells go through this process that's known as meiosis. Yes, it sounds like mitosis, and it is very similar, but it's different. And we'll learn more about that as we continue on here, learning about genetics. So, meiosis is a great process because it increases diversity, how much differences there are. It increases the diversity among the offspring, the babies. So with sexual reproduction, you need a sperm and an egg. In order to make a sperm and an egg, it has to go through meiosis. Our cells go through meiosis to get half of our DNA in one of those cells. And since you get half from mom and half from dad, well, then we have a lot more diversity amongst our babies because our babies are a combination of mom and dad. So the advantages of this is that it's going to be beneficial in an unstable or a changing environment. So this is the opposite of asexual reproduction. If your environment's changing, then sexual reproduction is going to be much more advantageous Because diversity, all those differences, diversity allows for adaptation. Also, new traits allow organisms to expand or to take over or to move into new environments. For example, the polar bear is successful around snowy environments because one of its traits is that it has really, really thick and white or clear hairs, which makes it camouflaged in the snow. But if that were down in the Colorado Rockies, the environment's not very white in the Colorado Rockies, and so polar bears would overheat and they wouldn't have very good camouflage. So their traits wouldn't really allow them to move into this environment. So they're pretty much isolated into the environment in which they fit into. So some advantages are just being prepared for an unstable or a changing environment, having diversity, and that diversity and new traits allow them to be able to move into new environments. But there are some disadvantages of having or using sexual reproduction. One of them is that it is costly to the organism. It takes a lot of effort because it requires courtship, where two organisms have to get together and find each other and then go through sexual reproduction as a pair. So it requires courtship between two individuals. And so that is costly. If you think about like the fact that elk have horns, it takes a lot of extra energy to grow those horns. And the fact that male peacocks have really beautiful tail feathers, it takes a lot of extra energy to make those tail feathers. Some animals do really elaborate courtship dances, which also takes extra energy in order to display their fitness of how fit they are so that they can earn the right to reproduce and go through sexual reproduction with the females. So it's costly because it requires the courtship. Also, a disadvantage is that some of the babies, but the scientific term that we're using is offspring, some offspring end up with traits that make them actually less likely to be able to adapt to the changing environment. So sometimes the traits can be beneficial and help in the new environments, but sometimes they can actually be devastating and negative. And if, for example, there was a albino black bear that was born, well, the blackness of a black bear's fur definitely helps it blend into its environment. But if it were albino, then it would stick out like a sore thumb. It would be a white bear in a forest environment, so it would not be advantageous, and that would be unfortunate. So there are advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction, just like there are in asexual reproduction as well. As we move throughout our genetics unit, though, we will be focusing on the diversity that's involved in sexual reproduction. So buckle your seatbelt. Here we go.